Um, my name is Andre. I am the science director for Archipelago Research and Conservation. We're an environmental consulting company that is based in Hanapepe, and I've been working on specifically endangered seabirds here on Kauai for about 12 years now. Started out with Kauai Endangered Seabird Recovery Project, and then went private in 2020. So I'm going to talk to you guys about endangered seabirds, just in general, and the threats they face here on Kauai, and then kind of zone in on the light attraction element, which is yeah. So we have three endangered seabirds here on Kauai. We have the A'o, which is the Newell shearwater, and Kauai is particularly important for the A'o because we have 90% of the world population. So really, the majority of the world's population of the species is found on Kauai, and so protecting them here is particularly important. And as we'll see later in this talk, this is the species which is most threatened by, this is the endangered seabird species that's most threatened by light attraction. So this is the one which you're most likely to find and save. They are listed under the Endangered Species Act as threatened. Really, they should be endangered, but they've been waiting for uplisting for years now on the ESA. So they're currently listed as threatened. But under the IUCN Red List, which is the list that lists all species on the planet, they're globally critically endangered. And on Kauai, they have suffered a 94% population decline in the last 2 or 3 decades. So they've done really badly on this island, which is their last stronghold. And just a point that they should not be confused with wedge-tailed shearwater or ua'ukani. This is the shearwater that people will probably be more familiar with. It's a coastal nesting shearwater. You can see them pretty easily in locations around Kauai. They are not threatened or endangered. However, they do face serious issues with predation. We just had 2 reports in the last week of mass wedge-tailed shearwater kills at spouting horn and salt ponds. So this is a species which, although it's not endangered, definitely faces a lot of threats on this island. And as you get into the latter part of the fallout season, this is another species that you will find as a fallout bird. The second endangered seabird on Kauai is the ua'u. This is the Hawaiian petrel. And we have about 1/3 of the world population on Kauai. So again, this is a really important island for the species. They're listed under the ESA as endangered, and they're also globally endangered under the IUCN list. Interestingly, the other populations in the Hawaiian Islands, the ones on Hawaii Islands and Lanai and Maui, all have different breeding periods. So ours are the latest of the Hawaiian petrels that breed, and other islands have breeding, their petrels are breeding up to a month earlier on Maui. They also have different calls, subtly different calls. And so what we're kind of seeing here, if you cast your mind into the distant future, is speciation at work, because these birds are slowly isolating themselves across the Hawaiian island chain. So it's pretty interesting to see the sort of evolution in progress. But for now, it's a species that's found, it's considered a single species that's found across the Hawaiian Islands, and we have 1/3 of the world population. And then lastly, our third endangered seabird is the akeake. This is the band-rump storm petrel. It's listed as endangered, recently uplisted as endangered under the ESA, but under the IUCN, it's least concern. This is because this species is found in the Atlantic and the Pacific, but almost certainly what we actually have here are a bunch of cryptic species all hidden under the same overarching species of the band-rump storm petrel. We took part in some genetic work a couple of years ago, and the outcome of that work was that the Hawaiian population is actually quite distinct from other populations, most closely related to the Japanese population, and probably a distinct subspecies, if not its own species. They're very small, have that really obvious white rump there, and that little bundle of fluff that I'm holding there certainly takes the prize as the cutest seabird of last year, and it was actually found by some of your searchers. I don't know if anybody found it is actually on the call today, but that was a really awesome bird to find, and you can see that one covered in down there. So it's a newly fledged chick.
Yes, I think Javen and Nathaniel were part of that, and Zach too, but I see them both on the line, so they're there.
Awesome. Yeah, well, that was a great find. That really was. And you know, there's very few of them found each year on Kauai, but I think it's mainly because they're so small and people don't really know what they're looking out for. So great work, guys, in finding that bird. That was an awesome one to get a hold of and take to SOS, and it got released fine. So it's somewhere out there at sea right now, which is great. So our endangered seabirds, they, unlike the Uaukani, these guys are found high up in the mountains. So here's the Kalalau Valley. And if you were to look for A'o or Ua'u, these are the kinds of places that you would find them. So the A'o in particular, like really steep areas in these sort of wet mountain forests. And the Ua'u are found more on the tops of ridges, but they are found in really remote parts of the island, and they're particularly hard to find. And then if you look on the Nepali coast, you also find populations of A'o breeding there, which is interesting because it's an entirely different habitat. It's the sort of dry sea cliffs as opposed to the wet mountain forests. And the A'o there are nesting in the sort of little ridges and ledges that are all along the Nepali coast. And this is also where you'd find the ake. So these guys, being small, will squeeze themselves into little holes and ledges along these sheer cliff faces. And these birds are impossible to get to. They're thousands of feet up. And they're really challenging to study. So this photo here actually is a photo from last week when we were up in Upper Limahuli. So one of the reasons why they're challenging to study is because they're in these really remote areas. These are really steep and densely vegetated sites. The birds don't want to be found. And they've been restricted to these areas now because of a bunch of different pressures, which we'll get to. So they really are in their most remote parts of the island now. Also, they're nocturnal when they come to land. So you're only going to find them flying around in these areas once it gets dark. So again, like working in these areas in the dark, especially challenging. And then during the day, if they're not in their burrows, this is where they are. So they're ranging far out to sea, and they don't flock together like you find the Uaukani. Those guys, you'll see them in big flocks around schools of tuna. But the Ua'u and the A'o, they're more solitary hunters. So and the ake as well. So they'll be spread out across the open ocean, making them challenging to study. And they face a number of threats on this island, which are all anthropomorphic, so caused by us. One of the major ones is power line collisions. These are, if you imagine these birds flying to and from their colonies up in the mountains, they have to cross all the power lines. They hit the power lines, and in some cases end up underneath them, either mortally wounded or get hit by cars subsequently. So power line collisions is responsible for taking thousands of birds over the years. And we have been working really closely with KAC to figure out how to deal with that. Here's a couple of ways in which we're doing so. So one is removing the power lines entirely, not with giant scissors, but just taking the lines down. We've experimented with lasers to make the power lines more obvious to the birds, because basically you're just trying to make these lines more visible to them so they can avoid them rather than flying into them in the dark. But the main way that we've been dealing with KAC on this is diverters. And KAC's done an amazing job over the last few years of adding diverters all across the island. So you'll see them dangling off the lines. This just makes the lines more visible, and we've found a huge reduction in the number of collisions since these diverters have gone up. And the other thing that they're doing as well as adding the diverters is removing that top static line. If you look at power lines that have not been modified, they have a static line up on the very top, and that's the line which the birds typically collide with most, and they've been removing those as well. So this combination of power line modifications has had a huge positive impact on the conservation of these species. And then another major threat, and the biggest threat up in the colonies, is introduced predators. So we're talking cats, pigs, rats, which are 3 different species: Norwegian rat, Polynesian rat, and black rat, as well as the barn owl. And any of these sites that we go to, if you go to an area which has not been managed and hasn't been visited before, you'll find predated birds by any of these predators. It's pretty amazing where these animals can get to. I mean, cats can be found from the coast all the way up to the highest mountains. And all these predators are devastating to our seabirds because the seabirds evolved on islands with no mammalian predators. So they're basically just nesting in holes in the ground. They don't have any defenses against these mammalian predators. And so the cats and the rats and the pigs and so on can find it really easy to target the birds when they're in their burrows, either by taking out the adults, the chicks, or the eggs. And here's, some of the grim leavings of after a predation event. So these are the kind of cues that we use to figure out what has predated the bird. Different predators do different damage to the body of the bird. And so we can identify what the predator is. as well as using cameras. We have lots of cameras up in the mountains actually catching these animals in the act. And this information gets used in our management areas. So actually, since I last talked to everybody, we've added another couple of management sites. So we now have 10, well, we actually have nine management sites for endangered seabirds on Kauai, with the 10th one underway. As you can see, they're all in the northwest, and this is because this is where the remaining birds really are. There are other birds around the islands, but for larger concentrations of endangered seabirds in areas where they're easy being a relative term, to manage, this is the area where they are. So we have these sites up here, a lot of them in Hononapali Natural Area Reserve, as well as Upper Limahuli, which is owned by National Tropical Botanical Gardens, and Honapu, which is on Dauphin land and state parks land. And within these management areas, we do the monitoring there. So we have a range of different techniques for monitoring the birds. We do auditory surveys at night to count the birds coming in and to understand where they're distributed across the management sites. We look for burrows, and when we find burrows, we mark them with permanent tags, and then we follow them through the year to understand how the birds are doing, whether they fledge or fail, if they're being visited by predators. We have cameras on many of these burrows, so we have somewhere in the region of 220 odd cameras at management sites. And these are really important for understanding how the birds are visiting their burrows, but also, like this cat on the top right corner, cat visitations and predations and other predators. So that the cameras give us a lot of really important information. And then this box down here is our acoustic sensors. So we have these distributed around the management sites as well, and they measure the sound of the birds as they're calling around the around the management sites. The birds have very distinctive calls, and so from those calls, we can create call rates with our acoustic sensors, and then we can plot change in call rates over time. And what we found is that, and this is probably not surprising, if there's more calling, there's more birds. It's very closely related, statistically significant, and so therefore, if call rates increase, bird numbers are increasing. If call rates decrease, they're decreasing. And so we can then identify whether management's working or not. Just gonna have a quick drink of water. Okay. And the management leads into predator control. So we don't do the predator control. This is undertaken by HALEX or NTBG, depending on the site. But predator control is the most important management tool that we have in these sites. And these are a mix of live and kill traps for all the different predators, as well as ungulate fencing to keep ungulates out. And what we found over the years, and we've been working with some of these sites, like I said, for 12 years, is that with predator control in effect, the birds respond really, really well. And all of our management sites, we're now getting more and more birds on the ground, more and more birds breeding. Clearly, if the birds aren't being eaten, then they can reproduce and produce more birds, and that's exactly what we're looking for. So it's really great to see in these sites management actually working and being really effective for these endangered birds. And then we also have, in a couple of these sites, these predator-proof fences. So this one here on the left is at Honapu, and the predator-proof fences are such that not even a mouse can get through. So the idea here is you create a predator-proof fence around however big you can make the area. They're typically quite small. And then we set up artificial burrows. Those are some artificial burrows on the ground there with cameras. And you can see that little speaker there. Within these sites, we also broadcast the calls of the birds. So you play the sound of the a'o, and it attracts a'o. They're very social birds. Same with the ua'u. So once you start playing these calls, you start attracting the birds into this highly protected site. And we've also been experimenting with the use of decoys as well, just to show the birds, to get the birds to hear there's lots of birds because you're playing the calls, and then to see that there's birds on the ground, which are the decoys. And all these kind of tools pull birds in from areas where they're unprotected and vulnerable to predators into an area where they're highly protected by this predator-proof fence. So we have a couple of these up and running, one at Honapu, one at Poakea, with a couple more in the works. And it's exciting to see how quickly this works. Here's an example. So this is a a'o. This photo is taken at Honapu. We had birds on the ground next to speakers within a couple of days. And you can see this is actually a really cool picture. You can see how that bird, he's really calling, and you can see how his throat is sort of expanding as he's making his sort of braying donkey call. And this bird was just calling and calling all the time and running back and forth. And he's now set up a nest inside that artificial nest box. Hasn't got a partner yet, but he is trying. So we're really excited about these fences, and we're looking forward to seeing how quickly the birds respond and start breeding in these sites. Plants are another major threat. You know, we have these huge habitat modifying plants like guava, invasive plants, guava, ginger, Australian tree fern. And because these birds are nesting on the ground and holes in the ground, all you need to, if these plants change the structure of the understory and make it impossible to create a burrow, then the birds can't nest. And so these plants are a major threat in some of these areas where you're just seeing these huge fields of guava or huge fields of ginger and no birds anymore, where there used to be, you know, pristine forests of ohia, lapa lapa, aluhe. So the introduced plants are a big issue. There's quite a few organizations out there now dealing with introduced plants, but they're really hard. I mean, ginger, for example, you can cut that stuff down and treat it with herbicide, and next thing you know, it's starting to sprout back up again. You got to keep treating it. So that's another pretty serious threat. And then at sea, as these birds are seabirds and they're heading out to catch their neon flying squids and flying fish and juvenile goatfish and all the predators, all the prey that they're after, who knows what they're facing out at sea. And so we've done a lot of tracking work over the years to try to understand where these birds are feeding, because then we can start looking at those areas of sea and understand whether there are potential threats there. So for example, that top right series of tracks, those are a'o feeding off of Upper Limahuli. You can see they're not going that far away, a couple 100 kilometers to feed. But then if you look at the track on the bottom, that's a ua'u. And these guys, they do one of the pairs doing a 3-day trip, which is kind of mirroring where the a'o are going. But the other one of the pair is actually going 14 to 20 days away, often up towards Alaska, to feed in these nutrient-rich areas before they come back to feed their chicks. So pretty amazing journeys for these birds. And then this is wintering grounds for a'o. So these are all chicks that have left Kauai for the first time, never flown before, and they start heading south, thousands of kilometers to the southwest, this intertropical convergence zone, which is a really high nutrient zone where all these different currents and countercurrents are reaching each other. You get these upwellings and huge concentrations of things like tuna, and then smaller fish, which is where what the birds are preying on. So they're all heading down to these areas. They've got very specific places to go. And then hot off the press, this map, the paper is actually coming out hopefully next week or the week after. This is ua'u chicks leaving Hawaii and heading off for their first wintering ground. You can see these ones are all heading over to the Philippines and Japan, South China Sea, which is where they're concentrating in their first winter. So, you know, this is one of the challenges of conservation of seabirds, is that they may be nesting in one area like Kauai, but then they're going and spending huge amounts of their time in other areas like the Philippines. And the Philippines and Japan and South Korea, these are areas where there's a lot of squid fisheries, which involves bright lights at night with huge numbers of squid being caught. And so that clearly is a potential threat to birds over there, as well as issues like climate change, changing the waters in these areas, plastic pollution. So there's a whole range of threats at sea which could face these birds, which we are not necessarily able to act upon here on Hawaii, although globally we can. So the threat that you guys are all going to be dealing with the fallout is light attraction. And these are some photos I just took over the last few days of lights on this island. People still have really bright lights out and about in some areas. And so you can see, for example, this top right-hand one is a classic bad light. It's a wall-mounted light with no shielding, which is just broadcasting light into the sky. The top left, you've got the bright lights bouncing off white walls, or the bottom ones, these are bright lights mounted on high up on palm trees. And so what you get is birds that are leaving the darkness of the colonies for the first time, heading out to sea, and they're using the moon and stars as part of their navigation. And instead, they see this constellation of lights on the ground in urban areas. And so they start circling them. They're like moths circling the flame. Eventually, they get exhausted and they end up on the ground. And we'll deal with a'o because this is the species that you're most likely to find. But you can see here, this is a sort of figure showing the phenology of a'o on Kauai arriving in April breeding throughout the year. And then we get to October, and this is October period, starting really at the end of September, but realistically the beginning of October, with a huge peak in the middle of October, and then the last birds tailing off through November towards the beginning of December. So this is the period when light attraction is really impacting our A'o fledglings. And breaking that down, so if you look at this circled area in October, these are the percentage of birds fledging from the colonies. And you can see that within October, there really is this peak, which is the second and third week of October, where we got a lot of birds. This is when most of these birds are leaving their nest and heading out to sea. So this is the time when fallout is going to be most pronounced for A'o. And the other thing to bear in mind is, and this is why searching occurs both after dark and before dawn, is that there's two peaks of fledging at night. So you get a big peak of birds that are fledging just after dark, and then they sort of spread out across the night, kind of tapering off as you get towards midnight. But then you get towards dawn again, another spike of birds. So if you only search at night in the first few hours after dark, you're going to miss all those birds that would have fledged early in the morning. And this is why searching occurs at twice during the evening, because otherwise you're missing those early morning birds. And by the way, this paper is one that we put out this year on the phenology of A'o. So a lot of this information on timing of fledging and so on is in this paper. If anyone's interested, I'd be happy to send it to you all. It's quite useful for understanding management for this particular species on Kauai. And so once these birds have circled and ended up on the ground, there's one on the bottom left just sitting there staring at the wall after it's been attracted by the lights. Then the middle picture there is an ua'u, which was attracted by those lights across the road, got hit by a car, and then birds that are flattened on the road. So they're exhausted, they're dehydrated, they're completely confused because this is not what they're expecting to happen to themselves. They become really vulnerable to being run over or to being eaten by predators. And so every single bird that you guys find is one endangered bird that's going to be saved from almost certain death. So searching for grounded birds is extremely important as a conservation tool on Kauai. And you can see these are birds here that were, these are fledglings that have been collected by SOS over the years. And, you know, we've log transformed the data, but the take home message there is you can see that huge decline over time. So for a while there, they were getting lots of birds. And it's kind of crazy. They were in the 80s, they were getting up to 2,500 fledglings a year, which, I mean, now we're down to maybe 150. So searching for fallout birds in the 80s was a very, very different scenario than what we're dealing with now. They were literally picking up bucket loads of birds and letting them go, and then driving all the way back along their transects and picking up bucket loads of birds again. So we're nowhere near that anymore, unfortunately. And this really does show how badly these birds have done over the years. If we're down to, you know, 100, 150 in a season compared to 2,500, that's a huge population crash. And I just want to take one quick step backwards to talk about light attraction of adults, because this is also important just for you guys to understand light attraction and also where to be searching for birds. So light attraction for adults is not really a problem on Kauai. And that's why fallout searching is only happens during the fledging season. But there is one scenario where light attraction can impact adults, and that's if you have really bright lights near colonies. And so a couple of years ago, we had this situation up at the Air Force Station where they had really bright lights. They'd made them green because green's supposed to be, you know, less attractive to seabirds. But as you can see from that right-hand picture, the lights were really bright and orientated partly upwards. And so they had a huge fallout of adult birds. This is the only kind of scenario where you'd be worried, really worried about adults being grounded, as if you had really bright lights near these colonies. And this is, you know, right next to the Kalalau and Honapu. But I thought this one was an interesting one to talk about because this is the kind of things that how we were finding the birds. And, you know, we got sort of 45 birds in one night. It was birds raining out in the sky. I've never seen anything like that before, and hopefully never will again. But the birds were, as soon as they were landing, it was really interesting from understanding fallout point of view to see what they did. And what the birds would do is they would sit there for ages just staring at fences or walls because they just totally stunned and not really sure what had happened to them. And then the next thing that they would do is crawl into the deepest, darkest hiding places that they could find. So that top right-hand bird is way down in a hole right at the end. And the bottom left is a bird that's under a big structure, like just crammed himself in underneath the structure. And so this is what they do. This is where you're going to find fallout birds if they've been on the ground for a little while and they're seeking shelter. They're not just going to be out in the open. They're going to be really well hidden. And so it really requires getting down on your hands and knees with flashlights and looking into these little crevices and holes and under machinery, under wooden pallets, anywhere which is dark and in theory safe for the bird. That's where they're going to go, because that's the kind of habitat in which they would have come. That's what their nests look like. That's the burrow where they would have come from, their burrows. And these birds, the ones that were not found that night, we went back the next day during the day, and they hadn't taken off. All they'd done is gone and hide and continue to hide. And then the next night, if we didn't find them, they would just come wandering back out, stare at the lights, and then go wandering back in again. So once these birds are grounded and on the ground, the chance of them ever taking off again are pretty small. They're not well adapted to taking off from flat ground. They're confused, they're weak, and they're going to hide in really like out of the way places. And so fallout is really associated with the moon. I'm sure you guys all know this, but this is just a graphs by year showing in blue, showing fallout of A'o, and in red showing moon phase. So when the moon's bright, red, the peaks is when the moon's really bright, and the troughs are when the moon's basically a new moon. You can see that when there's no moon, the light attraction becomes more pronounced. And that is because if there's a full moon or a bright moon out, the effect of the lights of urban lights is much diminished because the birds have the moon to look at. But if the moon's down, then the lights become even more apparent to them. So it becomes far more attractive. And you can also get scenarios where the moon may be really bright, but it's really misty and rainy. On those nights, you're also likely to get peaks and fallout, even if it's a really good night for trying to get birds out because the moon's up. The mist and the rain will just obscure the moon and also amplify the effects of light attraction. And so I had a look at October 2023, and I got to say, it looks bad. We've got the new moon right in the middle of the fallout season. You can see that week of the 9th, the 15th, and then 16th to 19th. That's a new moon, and that's unfortunately right in the middle of peak fallout period. So I would say going to be pretty busy this year. And the other thing to bear in mind when you're thinking about the moon phase is also when that moon is up. So although you've got a nice full moon at the beginning of October, on that particular day, for example, the moon actually sets at 1:37 in the afternoon, and then it doesn't rise again until almost midnight. So in effect, even though it's a pretty 60% illumination, it's actually pitch black during the peak fallout period for the first wave of birds. So moon phase is really important, and also time of moon set and moon rise, that combination. On the flip side, if you have not a particularly big moon, but it's already up by the time it's gotten dark, then that can help to counter the effects of fallout. So paying attention to moon set, moon rise, and also moon phase is key to understanding what's going to be a bad night. And just to go back to that Kauai Air Force example, again, this is adults, not fledglings, but you can see here that they basically all concentrated fallout on that new moon part of the night. So moon illumination was basically 0. We had really misty nights, and so we had huge amounts of fallout. So, although this is adults, not fledglings, it's the same process. This is why they're being grounded, is because of the moon and the weather. And then looking at your search area, I'm sure some of you guys have more experience than me now at this stage on searching these areas, but these are certainly parts of the site where we've seen a lot of fallout in the past. That sort of area around Sunset Bar and Grill, for example, we used to call that Nesh Corner, Neil Shearwater Corner, because you get birds all over the place there. Down by the pier, there's some particularly bright lights down there, which often attract birds. KUC have a fair amount of light attraction, although they obviously deal with their own fallout searching. And then that area opposite KUC as well. And then down by the dock, we've often had a lot of birds. So there's a lot of places for birds to hide in these areas, and pretty much everything's fair game. But certainly paying attention to areas with brighter lights. It might not even necessarily be a particular landowner's lights. It could be bright lights that are nearby that bring birds in, then they circle around and hit a wall or something. So you just gotta, treat each area, all of the area as an important search area. but there's certainly some areas where we've seen more birds than others. And then just lastly, last slide, as well as the a'o, you know, let's not forget there are other species. So the ua'u are going to start falling out later, at sort of towards the end of October through November into mid-December. They are much less affected by light attraction, but they are still affected by light attraction. So, you know, while SOS may get 150 plus a'o in a year, they may get 1 to 9 ua'u. So their numbers are pretty low of ua'u, but they definitely get them, and you may find them. And then certainly let's not forget that little bundle of fluff there, the akeake, storm petrel chicks. You may be lucky enough to find one of these guys out there, but they're going to be even harder to find than anything else. And then this is an ua'u kani chick, the wedge-tailed shearwater. They're starting to fall out around the same time as ua'u. On Oahu, for example, there's hundreds of ua'u kani chicks falling out. So they're definitely another species that gets impacted by light attraction, and we do find a lot of them here on Kauai. And SOS gets a lot of them too. So that's everything from me. Happy to take any questions. I did just want to say, you know, I've really enjoyed seeing what you guys have done over the last few years, searching for birds. You've done a fantastic job, saved a lot of endangered seabirds, and I know it's really hard work, you know, at antisocial hours, but I hope you get a lot out of it in terms of, you know, knowing that every single one of those birds you found was a dead endangered seabird if you hadn't found it. And now hopefully it's out there flying at sea and one day be coming back to nest on our beautiful island and produce more endangered seabird chicks. So that's it from me. I'll stop sharing.